Before skyscrapers lit the Shanghai skyline, before Mumbai's docks were bursting with trade, there was one name whispered in the corridors of power from east to west: Sassoon. A family so rich, so influential, that even the mighty Rothschilds of Europe took notice. They built glittering synagogues in the east, dined with British aristocrats in the west, and moved millions across oceans without lifting a sword. Their empire was built on silk, spice, and silver, but also on something far more destructive. Behind their lavish mansions and polished family portraits was a truth that would later haunt generations. The Sassoons didn't just trade goods, they traded addiction. Their fortune was built on a single crop, poppies, and their legacy, carved from the ruins of opium dens across Asia. This is Hidden Billionaire, and today we uncover the dark history of the so-called Rothschilds of the East, a dynasty that helped build the modern world by quietly stealing it. And to understand how they pulled this off, how a family of Jewish refugees from Baghdad became puppet masters of Asia's economy, we have to start at the beginning, the day one man fled persecution and stepped onto the shores of British India. David Sassoon was no ordinary refugee. Born in Baghdad in 1792 to a prominent Jewish family, he lived a life straddling two worlds. His father, Sassoon ben Saleh, was the chief treasurer to the Pashas of the Ottoman Empire, a job that gave David early access to the tools of money, influence, and diplomacy. That role came with immense prestige, but also with dangerous proximity to Ottoman politics, where alliances were fragile and trust rarely lasted more than a few seasons. David grew up at a crossroads, surrounded by sacred texts and synagogue rituals at home, and imperial coinage and trade documents at work. His education included the Torah and the Talmud, but also Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Hebrew. This linguistic dexterity, absorbed as naturally as breath, would become one of his greatest weapons in business. He could speak to Muslim clerics, British officers, and Chinese traders without a translator. In a colonial world divided by language and culture, David was a bridge, and bridges get paid. In the 1820s, persecution of Baghdad's Jews intensified. The Pasha, who had once trusted the Sassoons, began targeting the very community that had served him. Synagogues were raided. Wealthy families were extorted. The cracks in Ottoman tolerance became chasms. David had a choice: stay and risk everything, or flee into the unknown. He chose exile, first to Persia, then further east. In 1832, he arrived in Bombay, what we now call Mumbai, a refugee with no formal position, but a mind already calculating his next empire. He brought with him more than business instincts. His first wife, Hannah Joseph of Basra, came from another wealthy Jewish family, and their union created social and commercial ties across the region. She bore him 4 children before her untimely death. But it was his second marriage to Flora Haim that would truly shape history. They had 10 more children, 8 sons and 2 daughters, each of whom David raised with purpose. By 1832, he had arrived in Bombay, penniless but determined. What he saw there wasn't just refuge, it was a world on the edge of transformation, and it all started in Bombay. There, David set up shop in the textile trade, sourcing fabrics from India, selling them in the Middle East, and reinvesting the profits to expand his reach. But this wasn't a simple case of buy low, sell high. David played the game like chess. He built warehouses close to British shipping lanes. He made generous donations to local charities and quietly to colonial administrators. He funded schools and hospitals, and at the same time asked for preferential tariffs and military escorts for his ships. Philanthropy was not a distraction from business. It was part of the business. This strategic generosity helped the Sassoons secure licenses and protection that other traders could only dream of. While competitors got taxed or delayed, Sassoon ships passed freely, often carrying more than just fabric. Because by the late 1830s, David had found something even more profitable than cotton: opium. At the time, the British were growing poppies in India, turning them into opium bricks and shipping them to China, where millions were becoming addicted. But they needed distributors, people who knew the local terrain but didn't ask questions. David Sassoon stepped in, He bought up opium directly from British-run farms. Then, using his network of sons and allies, he set up supply chains across India and into China. The product moved from poppy fields to port cities, then onto ships and into the heart of the Qing dynasty's most vulnerable provinces. Indian farmers were increasingly being forced to grow poppies instead of food. Some protested, others starved, but the demand for opium and the profits it brought kept expanding. British officials turned a blind eye. After all, their own economy was booming. Meanwhile, Chinese communities were being hollowed out. Addiction was everywhere. Families were selling their belongings, sometimes even their children, to afford another hit. Local leaders begged for help, but help never came. In the middle of all this, David Sassoon's wealth exploded. His sons managed different regions, one in Shanghai, another in Singapore, a third in Hong Kong. Each acted like a CEO of a branch office, reporting back to the family patriarch in Bombay. They built schools and synagogues in every city they touched, not just for image, but to reinforce a sense of moral legitimacy. The Sassoons weren't pirates or smugglers in their own eyes. They were builders. And yet, behind the walls of every synagogue they funded, behind the stained glass and the sacred texts lay ledgers. Ledgers filled with figures, shipment volumes, opium weights, profits. Morning prayers were followed by afternoon calculations. Charity and commerce woven tightly together. It was a paradox, but it worked. The Sassoon family didn't need armies. They had shipping routes, silver coins, and the blessings of the British crown. What made the Sassoons different wasn't just that they were smart. It's that they were perfectly positioned, culturally, politically, and geographically, to exploit a world in transition. At a time when Asia was being cracked open by European powers, the Sassoons stepped in as the ultimate middlemen between empire and opportunity. They spoke the languages. They knew the customs. They understood how to navigate between Persian bazaars, British boardrooms, and Chinese port cities. To the British, they were reliable and familiar enough to trust with trade. To locals, they weren't quite foreign enough to be hated like the colonial overlords. They walked the tightrope and collected tolls on both ends. At the heart of it all was the opium trade. By the 1840s, opium was no longer just a product. It was a system. Britain grew it in India, sold it in China, and used the profits to buy tea, silk, and porcelain. This trade triangle fueled the British economy, and the Sassoons became its central nerve. They didn't just buy and sell, they controlled. They built warehouses near military forts, they organized fleets that moved like clockwork, and in every key port, Bombay, Calcutta, Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, they installed one of their sons. Each son was more than a trader. He was a consul, a negotiator, a logistics chief, and sometimes a spy. They bribed local officials. They partnered with British commanders. They paid protection money to pirates. Whatever it took. The British loved it. It was free market efficiency with colonial results. And when China tried to resist, the empire fought back. In 1856, the Second Opium War exploded. China had tried to shut down opium imports. Britain and France responded with warships. Chinese cities were bombarded, palaces burned, and after China lost, again, they were forced to open 11 new treaty ports to foreign trade. It was one of the most humiliating chapters in Chinese history. Today, it's known as part of the Century of Humiliation, a period when foreign powers carved up China's economy like a buffet. Sassoons opened trading houses in every major port. They signed deals with colonial administrators to set up shop on prime waterfront real estate. Their ships carried opium on one trip and textiles on the next, doubling their profits with each voyage. They offered loans to local merchants, then acquired their assets when they couldn't pay. They built banks, invested in docks, expanded into cotton mills and real estate. By the 1860s, the Sassoons were not just rich. They were essential to British dominance in Asia. And with money came social access. Albert and Elias Sassoon, David's eldest sons, transformed the business into a full-scale multinational empire. But they also transformed the family's image. from Eastern traders to Western elites. Albert in particular played the long game. He moved to London, bought property in Mayfair, and began entertaining British nobles in kosher dinner parties that felt exotic enough to intrigue, but respectable enough to be accepted. He funded hospitals, donated to universities, and built cultural bridges that made the family seem more aristocratic than mercantile. Eventually, Queen Victoria knighted him. He became Sir Albert Abdullah David Sassoon, Baronet of Bombay, a title that made it clear the Sassoons had arrived. But not everyone in the family followed the path of diplomacy and discretion. Reuben Sassoon, Albert's younger cousin, found himself in the middle of a scandal that rocked British high society. It started in 1890 with a card game. The Royal Baccarat scandal, as it would later be called, involved the future King Edward VII, then the Prince of Wales, and a small circle of aristocrats. They were staying at a country estate, playing high-stakes baccarat, a game illegal at the time. Reuben Sassoon was there. When one of the guests was accused of cheating, the prince stood by him. Reuben, caught between loyalty and legal risk, found himself entangled in a courtroom drama that dragged the royal family and the Sassoon name into the tabloids. The scandal embarrassed the monarchy and drew unwanted attention to the Sassoons' meteoric rise. Whispers began to circulate in drawing rooms. Where did this family's money really come from? But in true dynastic fashion, the family smoothed it over. Donations were made, apologies were exchanged. Reuben quietly stepped back from public life, while Albert doubled down on respectability, further embedding himself in British institutions. And as the scandal faded, the empire continued to grow. The Sassoons expanded into oil, steel, and shipping. They built textile mills in India and real estate portfolios in Hong Kong. Their fortune wasn't just surviving scrutiny, it was thriving because of how invisible the darker parts of their business remained. The British saw them as empire builders. Asian elites saw them as clever outsiders. Few saw the suffering that lay beneath the glittering numbers. But that suffering was real. Entire regions of India were locked into poppy farming, families unable to grow their own food because the land was controlled by colonial trade quotas. Chinese cities were filled with addicts. Laborers worked brutal hours for Sassoon-owned factories with no protections. The empire had grown beyond opium, but opium had built its foundation. And the next generation of Sassoons would face a question their fathers avoided. How do you preserve your legacy when the world starts asking where your wealth really came from? By the turn of the century, the Sassoon name had become a symbol of wealth, elegance, and influence, at least on the surface. They hosted soirees in palatial London townhouses. They owned banks and railways. They built libraries in Bombay and cathedrals of commerce in Shanghai. But for all their outward success, the dynasty was entering a new phase, one where image mattered almost as much as money. The empire was built, but now they had to defend it. That defense came in the form of art, charity, and influence. And no one wielded those tools more skillfully or more rebelliously than Rachel Beer. Rachel was born in 1858 into the Baghdadi Jewish branch of the Sassoon family. But she was not like the men in her family who ran trading houses or hobnobbed with colonial officials. Rachel was sharper, bolder, uninterested in just counting money. She wanted to shape the narrative. And she did. In 1891, she took the reins of The Observer, one of Britain's oldest newspapers. 2 years later, she acquired the Sunday Times. This wasn't a symbolic role. Rachel was the editor-in-chief, the first woman to hold such power in British journalism. At a time when most women couldn't vote or even attend university, Rachel Beer was influencing what Britain read every weekend. Her rise came at a cost. Her marriage to Frederick Beer, a Christian, created a rift with the Sassoon family. They considered it a betrayal of faith and tradition. Rachel, undeterred, built a media empire on her own terms. But her biggest moment would come in the firestorm of the Dreyfus Affair. In 1894, Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army, was falsely accused of treason. The case ignited anti-Semitic riots and divided Europe. Most newspapers fanned the flames. Rachel went the other way. She investigated the case herself, and in a bombshell move, published an interview in which the actual culprit, Count Esterhazy, confessed. That single interview helped shift public opinion and ultimately contributed to Dreyfus's exoneration. It was bold, dangerous, and transformative. But even as Rachel used her power for justice, she, like the rest of the Sassoon family, remained mostly silent about how their fortune had been made. There were no op-eds about the Indian farmers forced to grow poppies instead of wheat. No Sunday Times exposés on Chinese addiction rates or colonial corruption. The Sassoon legacy was being whitewashed, not erased, but rebranded. Their opium years were quietly swept into footnotes, while their philanthropy was pushed to center stage. In India, they built schools and hospitals. In London, they funded libraries and museums. In Shanghai, they constructed hotels and synagogues. To the public, they were no longer merchants. They were modernizers, builders of empire, patrons of culture. But it wasn't just the money that was being rebranded. It was themselves. The family was changing, not just what they owned, but who they were. They were Jews from Baghdad who had become British aristocrats. They still kept kosher, but now it was served on fine china under chandeliers imported from Paris. They still attended synagogue, but now they did it with knighthoods and baronetcies. To many in high society, the Sassoons were fascinating, a family that seemed to float between worlds. Jewish but not too Jewish, Eastern but also thoroughly Western, insiders and outsiders all at once. But that duality came with tension. Some branches of the family clung to their Baghdadi roots, preserving Hebrew texts, supporting Jewish education, and maintaining strong religious traditions. Others leaned into assimilation, marrying into British aristocracy, anglicizing their names, and retreating from the family's origins. Whispers about where the money came from never fully disappeared. The royal baccarat scandal had made things worse. And behind closed doors, younger members of the dynasty were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Questions about morality, about history, about legacy. One of those voices belonged to Siegfried Sassoon, a distant relative who would later become one of the most famous poets of World War I. Siegfried fought in the trenches, watched friends die, and returned home furious at the lies that sustained war and empire. He didn't speak much about the family business, but in his writing, there was always a tension, a sense that honor and suffering meant more than status or wealth. Meanwhile, as Britain and China negotiated an agreement in 1907 to gradually reduce the opium trade, the Sassoons shifted again. They began to divest from narcotics, pouring their money into more respectable industries, real estate, banking, manufacturing. But by now, the damage had been done. Entire economies had been reshaped. And when the 20th century roared to life, with revolutions, wars, and decolonization, the Sassoons would face a new challenge: survival in a world they could no longer control. By the 1920s, the Sassoon family was no longer just rich. They were relics of an era that was beginning to collapse under its own contradictions. The world they helped build, where trade was controlled by a handful of families and colonies bowed to foreign masters, was changing fast. Independence movements were spreading. Workers were organizing, and across Asia, the once invisible engines of empire were being dragged into the light. But even as the tide shifted, one Sassoon wasn't ready to give up center stage. His name was Sir Victor Sassoon. He was everything the earlier generations were not: theatrical, outgoing, and hungry for visibility. He wanted to transform, and his stage for this reinvention would be a city that, like the Sassoons, lived between worlds: Shanghai. In the 1920s, Shanghai wasn't just a port city, it was a playground for colonial elites, a melting pot of European bankers, American gangsters, Chinese tycoons, and everyone in between. And Victor was determined to make it his. He poured his fortune into real estate, banking, hospitality, and film. But his crown jewel was a building that still defines Shanghai's skyline today: the Cathay Hotel, now known as the Peace Hotel. 10 stories tall, dressed in Art Deco glamour, topped with a distinctive green pyramid roof, the Cathay was a masterpiece. Marble halls, silver service, secret passageways, and ballrooms that echoed with jazz and champagne. From his penthouse, Victor could gaze out over the Bund and imagine himself not just as a businessman, but as a brand. It worked. He threw parties for diplomats, movie stars, and royalty. His photo appeared in society columns. He became a sort of myth, the charming baronet from Bombay remaking Shanghai in his image. Victor knew the world was turning against everything the Sassoon Empire had been built on. The age of silent exploitation was over. In India, workers in Sassoon-owned textile mills were joining labor movements. Nationalist leaders like Gandhi and Nehru were calling out colonial profiteers, demanding justice for generations of economic servitude. Families that had been forced to grow opium instead of food were now resisting and organizing. In China, the wounds of the Opium Wars had never fully healed. The so-called Century of Humiliation wasn't history, it was memory. And both the nationalists and communists agreed on one thing: foreign control had to end. The Sassoons, once shielded by British gunboats, were now just another symbol of imperial greed. And then came the crash. In 1937, Japan invaded China, triggering full-scale war. Bombs fell on Shanghai. The international settlement, the zone where foreigners like Victor had once lived in safety, was no longer safe. Trade routes collapsed, fortunes froze, chaos returned. Victor, sensing the storm before it hit, fled Shanghai in 1941, just months before Japanese forces occupied the city. He moved back to India, then eventually to the Bahamas. The Cathay Hotel, once the symbol of Sassoon modernity, was no longer his. The empire had changed hands. For nearly a century, the Sassoons had outmaneuvered empires, crises, and revolutions by pivoting, adapting, reinventing. But now, the world has caught up. Colonialism was collapsing. The global order that had protected their wealth was being torn apart. After World War II, Asia didn't go back to business as usual. It redefined itself. India gained independence in 1947, and soon after, many Jewish families, including the Sassoons, began leaving Bombay. Their palatial homes became relics. Their factories were nationalized or sold off. Their old status, semi-native insiders with colonial power, was no longer viable. China, after years of civil war, fell to the communists in 1949. Private enterprise was outlawed. Sassoon offices, warehouses, and real estate holdings were seized. The fortune that had once flowed from opium and textiles now evaporated in a matter of months. By 1950, the Sassoon Empire, at least the one David had built and Victor had glamorized, was no longer a living dynasty. It was a ghost. What remained was architecture, legacy, and contradiction. The Cathay Hotel still stands on the Bund, now a luxury landmark for tourists. The Sassoon docks in Mumbai still buzz with activity, no longer moving opium, but fish. The David Sassoon Library, opened in 1847, still serves students and scholars, some of whom now research the family that built it. But the days of control were over. The family's later generations retreated into quieter roles. Diplomats, philanthropists, academics, they no longer shaped Asia's destiny, they merely observed it. And yet, one question remained. How do you tell the story of a family that gave libraries to Bombay and addiction to China, that preserved Jewish heritage and profited from colonial misery, that built a global empire only to see it dissolve as history caught up? That's what we'll explore in our final chapter, where the legacy of the Sassoons is no longer just wealth, but the conversation around what it means to build an empire and what it costs to keep one. By the 1960s, the last of the Sassoons who had shaped the old world were gone. Victor Sassoon, the flamboyant baronet who once ruled Shanghai skyline, died in 1961, alone in the Bahamas, far from the empire he tried to reinvent. The ports were no longer theirs. The markets were closed. The empire had become a memory. But memories don't fade that easily. In Mumbai, the Sassoon docks, built in 1875, remain one of the city's busiest fish markets, serving over 150,000 people. The David Sassoon Library, still standing with its Gothic arches, now houses students researching the very man whose money built it. His name is carved into the stone, but today's readers turn those pages with new eyes. Because now, people are asking, where did that money come from? For decades, the narrative had been one of philanthropy, education, progress. But as scholars began re-examining the roots of colonial wealth, the Sassoons returned, not as forgotten figures, but as case studies. In many ways, they were the perfect example. A persecuted minority who became power brokers, religious traditionalists who funded global trade, builders of hospitals and schools, whose profits came from addiction and exploitation. This wasn't a simple rags to riches tale, it was a paradox. In the 21st century, that paradox has only grown more visible. Universities, museums, and public institutions across the UK and India have begun confronting their ties to colonial-era fortunes. Some have added plaques, acknowledging the source of early donations. Others have launched entire research initiatives to study how families like the Sassoons profited off empire. One such initiative uncovered just how central the family was, not just to the opium trade, but to how global capitalism itself expanded in Asia.